Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that I think is super relevant to anyone in academia, and that's how to create a really, really strong CV. We've got this fantastic guide in front of us, and it's got me thinking,
Yeah.
in such a competitive academic world, how do we actually make our CV stand out, from all the rest of it?
That's the real question, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just not enough to just, list what you've done. Your CV, it's your academic story, right? It's your chance
Mhm.
to show everyone like what makes you unique and valuable to those potential employers or, future
I
collaborators.
see what you mean. So it's not just about listing accomplishments, it's about telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
But this guide keeps saying, tailor your CV to specific opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we know what to highlight before we even see it, a specific job posting? Is there like a pre-game strategy we can use here?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it this way. Before you even start writing anything, you really need to kind of figure out what is your academic brand? What are like your core research interests, right? And then what are those key skills and experiences that you have that really set you apart? Once you have a good understanding of your brand, then you can adapt it to different contexts.
Okay, so it's kind of like a personal mission statement almost
Exactly.
for your academic career.
Yeah,
That makes sense. But then how do we translate that brand into the actual CV?
right.
The guide mentions all these different sections:
Mhm.
education publications, research experience. It's a lot.
It can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah. But remember, the whole structure is there to kind of help you think of each section as like a chapter in your academic story.
Okay.
So the education section that sets the stage, right,
hmm
shows, your foundation and kind of where you've come from. And then you build on that foundation with sections like research experience and your publications. And that's where you really get to show your expertise and your impact.
So it's not just like a random assortment of facts.
Right.
So like you said, it's a carefully crafted narrative.
Exactly.
But what about those less obvious sections, like additional activities?
Uh-huh.
Does joining, the university book club really matter when you're applying for like a research-heavy position?
I mean, that's a great question. And that's where the concept of transferable skills comes in.
Okay.
It's about highlighting those abilities you've developed, maybe outside of your core research that could be super valuable in an academic setting.
Okay.
So, for example, leading that book club you were talking about,
Yeah.
that shows organizational skills and communication skills,
hmm
which are really important for teaching mentoring students, collaborating on research projects, even securing grants.
So even those activities that seem unrelated
Right.
can actually strengthen your CE if you kind of present them strategically.
Exactly.
Okay, now speaking of strategy, the guide also mentions that, different fields have different CV conventions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What are some examples of these differences? And how do we make sure we're playing by the right rules, so to speak?
Right. Academia is so diverse.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in the humanities, right, you might want to create a dedicated public engagement section
Oh, okay.
to highlight that impactful work that's beyond just traditional publications like op-eds, community workshops, or even collaborations with nonprofits.
Oh, yeah.
This can really demonstrate a commitment to making your research accessible and relevant to a broader audience, which is something that's super valued in a lot of humanities fields.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's not just about showcasing your academic achievements, it's also about demonstrating your impact beyond the ivory tower. I like that.
Exactly.
Now, I'm curious about the research experience section. What makes a strong research experience entry? And what are some common mistakes people make?
Yeah, that's a great question. The research experience section is where you really get to showcase your skills and contributions.
Yeah.
A common mistake that I see people make is just simply listing projects with like very vague descriptions.
Okay.
Instead, you should use this section to really tell a story about your research journey and emphasize your specific role and the impact of your work.
Okay.
For example, instead of saying responsible for data analysis, you could say something like analyze large data sets using specific software to identify key findings which led to specific outcome.
So it's about using action verbs
Wes.
and quantifiable results.
Absolutely.
Instead of just saying you did something, show them how you did it and what impact it had.
Right.
That's a great tip. Now, before we move on to the next section, I'm particularly intrigued by the publications and presentations section. It seems pretty straightforward, but are there any nuances we should be aware of?
Absolutely. The publications and presentations section is often seen as, the heart of an academic CV, especially in those research-focused fields. While it might seem like, you just list your work, there are some strategic moves that you can make to maximize its impact.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of strategic moves are we talking about?
One important consideration is how you actually group your publications.
Right.
Instead of just listing everything chronologically, think about creating subcategories that really highlight your expertise in different areas.
Hmm.
For example, you might have separate sections for peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, conference presentations, and even like invited talks.
So that makes sense.
This allows the reader to very quickly see the breadth and depth of your work and makes it easier for them to kind of find those publications that are really relevant to their interests.
That's a great tip. I never thought about organizing it that way. It's almost like creating a mini bibliography for each facet of your research.
Exactly.
Now, what about formatting? Does it
Oh.
really matter as long as the information is accurate and complete?
Formatting might seem like a minor detail, but it can actually make a big difference in how your CV is perceived.
Really?
A well-formatted CV is going to signal attention to detail and professionalism, while a sloppy one can actually detract from even the most impressive accomplishments.
So what are some key formatting tips we should keep in mind? I know the guide mentions things like font choice and margins, but are there any conventions that are specific to academic CVs?
Yes, absolutely. For instance, when you're listing your publications, be sure to follow the citation style that's standard in your field.
Right.
This might seem like a small thing, but it really shows that you understand and adhere to the conventions of your discipline.
Right, of course.
Another important tip is to use consistent formatting throughout the entire document. So if you bold the titles of your publications, do so consistently for every single entry. Don't switch back and forth between different styles.
Got it. Consistency is key. Makes
Nice.
sense. It's all about creating that cohesive and professional presentation. Now, one section that I've always found a bit tricky is the references section. Should you include them directly on the CV or just state references available upon request?
Oh, that's a question that comes up a lot. And the answer, like with many things in academia, it depends.
Of course, it depends.
Some fields expect references to be included on the CV, while others prefer them to be provided separately.
Okay.
The best approach is to consult with mentors in your field or look at examples of successful CVs from people in similar positions.
So ask the experts and see what the norms are in your specific area.
Got it. Now, I know we've talked a lot about tailoring the content of your CV, but what about having multiple versions of your CV? Is that a good idea?
Having multiple versions of your CV can be a really great strategy, especially if you're applying for a range of different opportunities. So, for example, you might have a longer, more comprehensive CV that you use for grant applications or fellowship nominations,
Okay.
and then a shorter, more focused CV that you use for job applications. You might even create specialized CVs for specific types of positions.
Oh, wow.
If you're applying for a teaching-focused role, you might want to create a version of your CV that really highlights your teaching experience and pedagogical skills.
So it's kind of like having a Swiss Army knife of CVs with different tools for different situations.
Exactly.
I like that analogy. Now, before we move on, I wanted to touch on something that was mentioned briefly in the guide, and that's the importance of language. It seems kind of obvious, but why is it so crucial to use clear, concise language, especially in an academic CV? You're right, it might seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people fall into the trap of using overly complex language or jargon in their CVs.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
Remember, your CV is likely to be read by people outside of your very specific subfield, so it's important to make sure that it's accessible to a wider audience.
So kind of like how you'd explain your research to someone who's not in your field.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Would you use technical jargon when explaining your research to your grandmother?
Probably not.
Probably not. And that's especially important in a document like a CV where you're trying to make a strong first impression.
So clear, concise, and jargon-free.
Got it.
Now, before we wrap up this section, I wanted to get your thoughts on one final point that stood out to me in the guide. It talks about the importance of highlighting the impact of your work, not just listing your accomplishments.
Right.
Can you elaborate on what that means and why it's so important, especially in a competitive academic environment?
Yeah, that's a really important point. In academia, it's not enough to just say you've done something.
Yeah.
You need to show how your work has made a difference, how it's contributed to your field, and maybe even beyond.
So it's about moving beyond just listing achievements
Mhm.
and actually demonstrating, their significance.
Exactly.
But how do we do that effectively in a CV?
Mhm.
Are there specific strategies we can use?
Oh, absolutely. One really effective strategy is to use quantifiable metrics whenever possible. So, for example, instead of just saying you published a paper,
Right.
you could mention how many citations it has, or if it was, featured in any high-impact journals or media outlets. And if you've given presentations, you could mention the size and scope of the audience or any positive feedback that you received.
So it's about adding context and showing, the reach of your work. What about for activities that might not have like those traditional metrics, like teaching or mentoring?
Hmm.
How do we highlight the impact of those experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. For experiences like teaching and mentoring, I would really focus on the outcomes. Did your students, achieve significant learning gains? Did your mentees go on to have successful careers in academia or related fields? And if you have any testimonials or letters of recommendation that speak to your impact, you might even consider including excerpts in your CV or providing them as like supplementary materials.
So it's about showcasing the ripple effect of your work,
Hmm. Yeah.
how you've influenced and inspired others. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier,
Hmm.
the importance of getting feedback on your CV.
Yes.
Why is that step so crucial? And who should we be seeking feedback from?
Feedback is essential because it really helps you see your CV through the eyes of others. It can help you identify areas that might be unclear or confusing, highlight strengths that maybe you didn't even recognize, and even uncover potential biases that you might have inadvertently introduced.
So it's like having a fresh set of eyes,
Yeah.
someone who can provide like an objective perspective.
Exactly. And when it comes to seeking feedback, I always say cast a wide net. Talk to your advisor, your mentors, peers who have recently been on the job market, and even people outside of your immediate field. They can all offer, valuable insights and perspectives.
That's a great tip. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. Now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. Crafting a compelling academic CV is a journey, a process of continual refinement and reflection. It's about showcasing not just what you've done, but who you are as an academic and the impact you've made.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, this journey doesn't have to be a solo endeavor. Seek out resources, connect with mentors, and leverage the collective wisdom of the academic community.
And speaking of resources, for even more tips and insights on crafting a stellar CV, be sure to check out academicjobs.com.
Great resource.
They have a wealth of information specifically tailored for academics at all stages of their careers. This has been The Deep Dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.